Hello friends. Today I wanted to take this opportunity to talk to you about my Cricket World Cup memories. So let us start with the first two World Cups, 1975 and 79. Of course, I wasn't born then, so my only memories of these two World Cups is what I've seen on TV and on the internet. 1975 World Cup, the things I clearly remember about 1975 was the fact that India actually won their first ever World Cup game in 1975. This was a game against East Africa, where India managed to beat East Africa pretty comprehensively in that World Cup. The other not such a standout performance was by Sunil Gavaskar. India played against England in that World Cup. Dennis Amiss got a big 100. England got a huge score, and in response, India scored 120 runs, batted all 60 overs, and Gavaskar especially scored 36 runs throughout the innings, and he was unbeaten. So again, a not so happy memory of 1975. The other thing I remember about 1975 was the finals, where West Indies was playing Australia and Clive Lloyd got 100. And there was another upcoming star who displayed a lot of brilliance on the field in that World Cup final. That was Viv Richards. He I believe, got 3 or 4 runouts. And folks who have watched that World Cup have often said that they already knew when they were watching Viv Richards that he was meant for greatness. And he had displayed that on the field in that World Cup final. Now let's move to 1979. India had a terrible World Cup. India, in fact, did not win a single game in that World Cup. India even lost to a lowly Sri Lanka back then, who were not even a test nation. So a very disappointing World Cup for India. The other things I remember from that World Cup, of course, were the West Indies. They were on the rampage once again with their fast bowling quartet, wreaking havoc across the board. The finals was again very memorable. Viv Richards this time displayed his class in the finals. He got 100. Surprisingly, that was not the most memorable innings of the finals. That innings was played by Collis King. Collis King, he had a big partnership with Viv Richards, and he outscored Viv Richards, scored 86 out of 66 balls, and that innings is still remembered. Now let's look at 1983. Now that is the first World Cup I remember watching. Just a small trivia regarding personal experience with 1983. That was the year we got a color television in our house, and in fact we watched the World Cup finals on our own television set, which I distinctly remember. I was very, very young, but I still have vague memories of watching that World Cup. Some key highlights of the 1983 World Cup, of course, was India's brilliant performance in the World Cup. They were absolute underdogs. Nobody gave India a chance, but then India turned up victorious at the end. A little bit of background on the 1983 World Cup. The Indian team was touring West Indies right before the World Cup, and there was a game in Berbice, Guyana. That was the last one-day game of the tour, and India had been battered and bruised in that series. The West Indies had completely demolished India in most of the games. But that one game, India actually fought valiantly. Wrong for me to say valiantly, but India played really well, and India in fact beat the West Indies in the last game. It was a high-scoring game, and India came into the World Cup with the confidence that they had beaten this West Indies team in a one-day game right prior to the World Cup. And that in those days used to be considered a big deal. And India came into the World Cup with that added confidence. India's first game in the '83 World Cup was again with the West Indies, and India managed to beat them. Yashpal Sharma was the star from India, and India got off to a flying start by beating the West Indies in the first game. The other memorable game from the 1983 World Cup was, of course, the famous game against Zimbabwe that was played in Tunbridge Wells. Unfortunately, there's no recording of that game because I believe BBC was on strike on that day. But all of us know how that game shaped up. India batted first. India were 9 for 4, 17 for 5. And that is when Kapil Dev, the Indian captain, decided to show everyone, what it meant to be India's captain and what a player he was. He got some support from Roger Binney, Madan Lal in the lower order, but what he achieved there was unbelievable. That innings that Kapil Dev played, the 175 not out, I believe completely transformed the way the one-day game was played. So I think the impact that 175 had on one-day cricket was something that cannot be measured. It was an incredible innings. Kapil Dev started very slowly, rotating strike, and then he exploded towards the end. Unfortunately, there is no recording available for that game. That again, in the middle of the World Cup, beefed up India's chances even more. The other thing that not a lot of people are aware, Kapil scored a 175 against Zimbabwe, but he also got a 5-wicket haul in that World Cup, which is a rare feat for somebody to get 100 and a 5-wicket haul in the same World Cup. But Kapil Dev was a cricketer who actually made that happen. West Indies, as usual, barring the defeat against India, was still going strong. Both India and West Indies made it to the semi-finals. India played England. India beat England comprehensively. And West Indies beat Pakistan and made it to the finals. Now, the setting of the final was such that the final was being played at Lord's. There is a slope at Lord's on the main pitch, which is supposed to assist fast bowlers tremendously. And the kind of fast bowling lineup that West Indies had, they were out and out favorites. It's a classic David versus Goliath story where India were absolute underdogs. India batted first. They were tormented by the West Indies fast bowlers. Couple of Indian guys got a start. Krishnamachari Shrikant got 38. Sandeep Patil and Mohinder Amarnath got, I think Mohinder Amarnath got 27. Sandeep Patil got 26. And India at the end of the first innings got only 183. Remember, back in the days, those used to be 60-over games. So 183 was not a great score. But like the cricket pundits say, when it's a big final, runs on the board can mean a lot and can put a lot of pressure on the opponents. West Indies, came to bat. They were very confident that they were going to lift the World Cup for the third time. Folklore says that during the break, Kapil had a quick word with the team. His inspirational words were basically that I know we've gotten only 183, but West Indies still needs to get that 183. So it's not a big score, but they still need to make the runs. So let's just go out there and give it our best and see where we land. And this really motivated the Indian team. The innings started in a sedate fashion. Desmond Haynes, Gordon Greenidge started the innings for West Indies. And it started off slowly and sedately, but then India was able to make the first breakthrough through Balwinder Sandhu. If you remember the banana and swing delivery that he got Gordon Greenidge with, it was an absolute beauty. It angled in and it moved out, which completely beat Gordon Greenidge all ends up. After dismissal, Gordon Greenidge walked in Sir Isaac Vivian Alexander Richards, and he started plundering the bowling. Madan Lal especially got some special treatment from Viv Richards, and as he started hitting boundaries, it felt like India was going to lose the plot there. You know, India was at a point where if Viv Richards could have batted another 4 or 5 overs, the match would have been over pretty quickly. Luckily, Madan Lal was persisted with, and Madan Lal bowled a shortest delivery outside the off stump, but Viv Richards tried pulling onto the onside. He got a little bit of a top edge, and luckily Kapil was the fielder who was under the ball. That catch is still memorable. I'm sure all of you remember that catch. He ran back and held on to this catch, which turned the tide in India's favor. Once Viv Richards was gone, the rest of the batsmen started panicking, and that's when the Indian all-rounders started putting the pressure onto the West Indies batsmen. There was Roger Binney, Mohinder Amarnath, Balwinder Sandhu, Kapil himself. And as in West Indies started losing wickets, panic started setting in, and one by one Dujon, the fast bowlers, started getting out. And if you remember, the final delivery of that World Cup was Mohinder Amarnath trapping Michael holding LBW, and you remember the scene. Gavaskar tried to go bag stumps after the victory, but he could not because thousands of Indian fans had flooded the pitch. Gavaskar could not get a stump. He had to run back to the pavilion. Again, an amazing story, and that's what transformed in cricket. Indians were considered minnows, especially in the one-day game up to that day, but that game changed the way the world viewed India. So that is my memory of 1983. Now let's talk about 1987. So 1987 was a big year for us. This was the first time the World Cup was traveling outside England, and India was the primary host of the event. Pakistan also were going to host a few games, but India was the primary host, and it was a thing of immense pride for us Indians that we were hosting the World Cup. I remember Reliance was the primary sponsors of that World Cup, and India and Pakistan were out and out favorites to get to the finals. And it started on a really good note. India had a very strong team, a number of all-rounders. We had a number of new young batsmen. There was Navjot Sidhu, who was an upcoming aggressive opener. Azharuddin had made his name by then. India still had Roger Binney, Madan Lal, Chetan Sharma, Kapil Dev. India had Ravi Shastri, Maninder Singh, a very strong spin attack, and then of course the batting was very strong. Shrikant, Gavaskar was still playing, Dilip Vengsarkar, Mohammad Azharuddin. So India was a very strong side. Similarly, Pakistan was being led by Imran Khan, very strong team. Imran Khan, Wasim Akram, Ijaz Ahmed, Ramiz Raja. So again, very strong team, plus they were playing majority of the matches at home. So these were considered to be the favorites. Now, while India was progressing very nicely through the initial stages of the World Cup, the other team which was quietly making its way up was Australia. Australia had undergone a complete transformation from their side. A number of their older players had retired, and Alan Border was their captain, and they had a number of upcoming youngsters like Steve Waugh, Simon O'Donnell, Dean Jones. None of these players who later on went on to become legends were established by then. So they had a very inexperienced side, but they started going up the rank pretty soon during the World Cup. Australia, in fact, beat India in one of the league games in the World Cup. I remember that distinctly. From that point onwards, Australians were being looked at as a dark horse, but still India, Pakistan, the way they were playing, were still the favorites. Couple of, again, strong memories of that World Cup. One of them was Viv Richards making a big 100 against Sri Lanka. He got 180 odd in one game. The other memory I have is the game against New Zealand. The reason I remember that game because that was Sunil Gavaskar's only one-day 100. In fact, that was one of the few games where Gavaskar actually scored at better than run a ball. If I remember correctly, he got 100 of 83 balls. So everything was going to plan. The semi-final lineup was set. India was going to meet with England at Eden Gardens, at Wankhede Stadium, and Australia were going to play Pakistan in Lahore. So my dad he actually managed to get tickets in advance for the finals. Everybody was expecting India Pakistan to make it to the finals, so he managed to get a couple of tickets, and my dad and I were supposed to go and watch the finals at Eden Gardens, where we were hoping it would be India versus Pakistan. Now that is the beauty of sport, the unpredictability. So India played England in Wankhede Stadium, and India by then had dominated with spin. Ravi Shastri, Maninder Singh were extremely successful until the semi-finals. England had different plans. Graham Gooch, especially right before the semi-finals, he specially practiced playing on deliveries on and outside the leg stump. He practiced the sweep shot because he knew he was going to play a lot of left arm spin, where our spinners would try to curb stroke play by bowling on the pads. And that practice that Graham Gooch put in, put him in really good stead, and he managed to get a big 100 against India in the semi-finals. By the standards of 1987, I think England got a pretty good score. England's got about 260, 270 runs in the semi-finals. India started very poorly. Gavaskar, that was the last time he was going to bat in a one-day game. He was castled by De Freitas. And then India continued to lose wickets at a regular interval. Azharuddin was the only player who put up a fight, but India ended up short. And our dreams of seeing India at Eden Gardens was shattered by England. Similarly, the Australia-Pakistan game, everybody expected Pakistan to beat Australia, but Australia managed to beat Pakistan. And the final lineup was Australia versus England. My dad and I were so disappointed that India-Pakistan did not make it to the finals that we decided not to go for that game, and we gave away our tickets. We know how the final transpired. Australia-England had a really close game. England was running away with the game when Alan Border decided to bowl himself, and Mike Gadding, who's a well-set batsman, tried to play a very extravagant stroke, tried to reverse sweep Alan Border, got a top edge and was out, and that opened the floodgates, and England lost all their wickets and eventually lost the World Cup final by 9 runs. So again, lots of expectations as far as an Indian spectator was concerned, but India could not defend their trophy. Now, coming to 1992 again revolutionized Cricket World Cup. The reason I say this is when the World Cup went to Australia, and the TV coverage of that World Cup blew everyone's mind. Channel 9 were the company that was managing the broadcast of the tournament, and they brought in so many different camera angles. They had the stump cam, and it completely changed the way we viewed one-day cricket, especially World Cup cricket. That was the first World Cup where people were going to play in colored clothing. So again, very, very, very memorable memories. My dad was posted in Calcutta, and we used to wake up early in the morning to catch the games. Unfortunately, by then the Indian one-day team wasn't very strong. We were definitely not one of the top 3 or 4 nations in that World Cup to start with, and we played as per our reputation. We had a very, very average World Cup, although Sachin Tendulkar and Azharuddin had some good innings in the World Cup, but as a team we flopped miserably. I think The only notable victory in that World Cup for India was the Pakistan game. As you would remember, Sachin was the man of the match. He got a 50, and then he bowled economically as well, and India managed to defeat Pakistan. Couple of other memories from that World Cup. So Wasim Akram, for those who remember that World Cup, initially struggled a lot in that World Cup. He was bowling a lot of no balls, and his rhythm was off in the first few games. Pakistan looked completely out of sorts. In fact, they were on the verge of being eliminated. There was a game against England where Pakistan was bowled out for 70 odd, and if Pakistan would have lost that game, they would have been out of the World Cup. But fortune favored the brave, and bad weather ended that game prematurely, and Pakistan split points with England. That was a lifeline that Pakistan needed, and from that point onwards, they never looked back. Australia, they were playing at home, but surprisingly, they were very inadequate in that World Cup. They did not take advantage of the home conditions, and they ended up not even making it to the semi-finals. So that was big news. The other surprise package of that World Cup was New Zealand. So New Zealand also were one of the hosts of that World Cup. Australia was the primary host, with New Zealand also hosting some games. So New Zealand did a great job. They had a team of a number of dibbly-dobbly all-rounders, and these all-rounders in New Zealand conditions turned out to be lethal, and they ended up winning most of their early games and made it to the semi-finals. There was Martin Crowe introducing Deepak Patel to open the bowling, so that was something absolutely out of the box that Martin Crowe thought about and executed in that World Cup. Mark Greatbatch opening the batting and going hammer and tongs in the first few innings, which was very rare in those days. So New Zealand, they did come up with these innovative ideas and made it to the semi-finals. Unfortunately, they ran into a really hot Inzamam-ul Haq in that semi-finals, where he, from nowhere, took Pakistan to victory. He scored 60 runs of 32 balls, and with assistance from Javed Miandad, won the game for Pakistan. Meanwhile, in the other semi-finals, England was playing against South Africa. South Africa remarkably had shown a lot of composure throughout the World Cup and had played really well. This was their re-entry into big-time cricket. Unfortunately, they ran out of luck in the semi-finals, where at one time they were placed reasonably well. They had to get 27 runs, if I remember correctly, of 21 balls, and they were interrupted by rain, and when they came back, they had to score 21 runs of one ball. So that robbed the South Africans of a place in the finals. So England barely made it to the finals, but again, they were going to play against a Pakistan who we know can be very hot and cold on their day. So Pakistan batted first. They got off to a slow start, and surprisingly, Imran Khan batted at number 3, and he and Javed Miandad put up a partnership, and then Wasim Akram and Inzamam, they got some big hits at the end, and they got Pakistan to a decent score, close to 250 runs in the finals. Now, England started shakily. They lost Ian Botham, Graham Gooch fairly early, but then Neil Fairbrother, he was one of their one-day specialists who started to build partnership with Alan Lamb, and England seemed to be running away with the game. That's when Imran Khan decided to bring Wasim Akram for a second spell, and what a spell it was. The first over that Wasim Akram bowled in his second spell, he bowled 2 unplayable deliveries. The first one to Alan Lamb, he bowled him an outswinging delivery, which Alan Lamb played inside the line, and he lost his off stump. Next ball, Chris Lewis walked in again. He was an all-rounder who had worked really well for England. This time he got an in-dipper from Wasim Akram, and he was bowled neck and crop. Those 2 deliveries completely changed the World Cup finals, and it led to Pakistan's victory. The other memory of '92 World Cup was Imran Khan lifting the trophy at the end. It was a beautiful crystal trophy, I remember, and Imran Khan decided to donate the prize money that they won to his cancer hospital. So that's another memory I have. Now that's 1992. Now let's talk about 1996. So 1996, the World Cup was again coming to India. India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan were going to host 1996. And India again were supposed to be front runners. India had a fairly strong team, established batting lineup, good spinners. So India started again very, very positively. The only loss India had in the initial stages was against Australia in Bombay, where Sachin, inspired scoring a really fighting 90, India could not win that game. But other than that, India generally played really well. The one match that stands out is the quarterfinal against Pakistan, which was played at Bangalore. That's a game which all the folks who watched that game would never forget that game. That was a high pressure, high intensity game where India batted first, and India managed to get close to 280 thanks to Sidhu and the middle order batting. Jadeja especially exploded in the last four overs, especially gave some special treatment to Waqar Younis, and India got a really good score. When Pakistan came to bat, their openers went hammer and tongs and started hitting the Indian bowlers out of the park. Amir Sohail and Saeed Anwar, they got them to a flying start. They were pretty quickly, they were close to 80 runs in 10 overs and they were running away with the game. That is when the famous Amir Sohail Venkatesh Prasad incident happened, where Venkatesh Prasad bowled a length delivery to Amir Sohail, who hit him through extra cover for a boundary, and then he exchanged some words with Prasad. He pointed towards the boundary with his bat, and all that drama happened. And guess what? Next ball, Venkatesh Prasad bowled a length delivery which Amir Sohail tried to hit again, and he played it onto his stumps. And then, of course, he got a royal send-off from Venkatesh Prasad. From that point onwards, India started getting wickets regularly, and then India ended up winning that quarterfinal. So that again was a terrific memory of that World Cup, that particular game. I also remember a Brian Lara century against South Africa. I believe it was a quarterfinal in that World Cup, where he single-handedly took on the South African bowlers and was responsible for West Indies making it to the semi-finals. The semi-finals, again, both the games were extremely exciting. The first semi-final was between Australia and West Indies, where Australia, they batted first and they had a top order collapse. Then Stuart Law and Michael Bevan took them to a fighting score. I believe they scored 210 or around about that score. That's what Australia got. And then the West Indies were cruising along. They were, I believe, 180 for 2 or 3. That's when Shane Warne decided to spin his web, and from that onwards, West Indies collapsed and they ended up a few runs short. On the other hand, Sri Lanka was playing against India in the semi-finals at Eden Gardens. Eden Gardens has been lucky ground for India, so Indians were really looking forward to that. If you remember, that World Cup was especially well known for the opening batting of Romesh Kaluvitarna and Sanat Jayasuriya. They had given the Sri Lankan teams explosive starts throughout the World Cup. In that semi-final game, India managed to get them out in the first 2 overs. Once Jayasuriya and Kaluvitarna were out, I think India started feeling complacent. But Arvinda De Silva from Sri Lanka had other plans. He decided to come and counter-attack. He got a quick fire 66, if I remember correctly, of hardly 45-50 balls. And he kind of pushed the score along, and Sri Lanka ended up getting about 250. So 250 in a knockout game in a World Cup is definitely a pretty good score. Although India had a strong batting lineup and the pitches had shown no demons by then, So India and the supporters were all confident that India would get the runs. India started really well. India although lost Sidhu's wicket, but then Manjrekar, who was batting at 3, and Tendulkar were batting well. Especially Tendulkar was in full flow. And India got to 90 odd runs for the loss of 1 wicket. And that is when things started to happen. All of a sudden, the wickets started to spin. And once Tendulkar was out, that's when everything went downhill from there. None of the other batsmen, Manjrekar, Azharuddin, Vinod Kamli, Jadeja, none of the other batsmen were able to even stay at the wicket. India at one stage were about 90 for 1 and they ended up at 120 for 8. That is when the crowd intervened, and India had already lost the match in all practicality, but because the crowd intervened, they started throwing stuff into the field. The match was called off and Sri Lanka was declared as the winners of the semi-final. So again, a sad ending to India's World Cup campaign. The final again was a great game. Australia batted first. They got close to 250 runs, which was again a very good score for finals. But then when Sri Lanka came to bat, they were a charged up team, and Arvinda de Silva was again in his elements. He got a big 100. Ranatunga was batting with him when they ended, and Sri Lanka ended up winning the World Cup, chasing almost 250 runs in a World Cup final, which was tremendous. So that brings us to the 1999 World Cup. This World Cup was when the World Cup was again going back to England. England had held the first 3 World Cups, and then the following 2 World Cup had happened in India and Australia. So England got the World Cup back for 1999. England were hoping to do well since they were the host nations, but that is one World Cup where England fared terribly. In fact, even Sri Lanka, who were the defending champions, their team had deteriorated significantly. The strongest team in the 99 World Cup were Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand. The Indian batting was strong, but the bowling again had a lot of questions to be answered. The Indian batting had Sachin Tendulkar, of course, opening the innings with Sourav Ganguly. We had Rahul Dravid, Ajay Jadeja, Azharuddin. So Indian batting was very strong. Unfortunately, India's bowling was very inexperienced. We had Kumble and Srinath, but the other bowlers were not as experienced. So India had a pretty average World Cup in 1999, although there were some real standout performances in the World Cup. The first game that comes to mind is the game against Sri Lanka, where Sourav and Rahul, they got a 300-run partnership. That was the first 300-run partnership in one-day cricket. Sourav got 183. It was an amazing innings, full of sixes and a lot of fireworks. Dravid played really well. He got 140 odd in that innings as well. The other thing I remember from that World Cup is that Sachin Tendulkar, he lost his father in the middle of the World Cup. He had to fly back to India, and then he came back in the game against Kenya and still managed to get 100. Again, that was amazing. It was unbelievable to see somebody with so much of mental fortitude that, in spite of having such a tragedy in the family, he was still able to come back and perform so well. So that's another innings that it's hard to forget. Like I said, India had some good individual performances. Rahul Dravid batted really well. Sourav Ganguly had a few really good innings. Sachin had one good innings, but overall India did not fare well, and India, although made it to the Super Sixes, but then bowed out of the tournament in the Super Six stage. The other team which was doing really well in that World Cup was Pakistan. Very, very strong side. They had a tremendous bowling lineup with Wasim Waqar, Shoaib Akhtar, Azhar Mahmood, Abdul Razak. So they had a fabulous team, and in fact they managed to beat Australia in the league games, and they were looking as the strongest team in the World Cup. Come semi-final time, it was South Africa versus Australia, and Pakistan was playing New Zealand. if you remember that Australia and South Africa game, one is never going to forget that game. That game ended up being a tie, but then Australia had beaten South Africa in the league phases, so they were declared as winners. So they made it to the finals, whereas Pakistan, they were able to comprehensively beat New Zealand and they were ready to face Australia in the finals. Pakistan, because of the manner they had played, the only defeat, the only not so good performance from Pakistan came against the game against India, where India beat Pakistan in the World Cup game. Also, Pakistan had another bad game, which was the game against Bangladesh, where Bangladesh beat Pakistan. But other than that, Pakistan looked very strong, and it looked like we were going to have a really strong World Cup final. Unfortunately, that is not how things materialized. Pakistan batted first and they collapsed. They got only 150 or even lesser than 150 in that game. Australia were able to easily knock those runs off and ended up being champion again after 1987. Now that brings us to 2003. Now 2003 personally was my favorite World Cup. The World Cup was happening in South Africa and Zimbabwe. India had a very strong team. If you remember in the last World Cup, India's batting was really strong, but India's bowling wasn't up to mark. This was one of the World Cups where India had a very balanced team. Of course, Australia was very strong and so was South Africa. So that World Cup started off with India playing Australia in the first league game, and India was walloped by Australia. So India started off really poorly. Then India had a game against, if I remember correctly, it was Netherlands. And even in that game, India barely managed to beat them. This is when back home in India, the supporters, they started to express their anger towards the performance of the Indian team. Effigies were burnt, players' houses were stoned, and all that was happening at the beginning of the World Cup. Gradually, India started to get their act together. Especially Sachin, as you all remember, had a phenomenal World Cup. Although he had only 100, but he had so many more impactful innings. He had a 98 against Pakistan. He had a superlative innings against Sri Lanka. And even against England. So he had a great World Cup. Saurav Ganguly had a great World Cup as well. He ended up scoring 300s. And overall, the Indian team played really well. The only defeat in that World Cup in the league phases for India was against Australia in the first game. But other than that, India managed to beat everyone comprehensively. Especially encouraging was the form of the Indian fast bowlers, Ashish Nehra, Javgal Srinath and Zahir Khan. They individually won one game on their own in that World Cup for India. You would remember the 6-wicket haul that Ashish Nehra had against England, which decimated England on that day. And India overall came back really strong and was one of the strong contenders to win the World Cup. Of course, Australian juggernaut was also on. They had beaten each and every side, including India, in the league games. And these two teams made it to the finals. We had a lot of hopes with India in that finals because India had played really well. India had played like champions, and we were expecting India to give a tough run for the money to Australia. Unfortunately, that did not happen. Australia batted first, and Indian fast bowlers, especially Zahir Khan, was extremely pumped up, but because of adrenaline rush, ended up spraying the ball all over in the first few overs, and that resulted in Australia getting off to a flying start. And then Ricky Ponting and Damien Martin kind of capitalized, and they ended up getting 360 runs in the World Cup final. I remember clearly I was a student at FIU during the World Cup, and in the first innings when Australia were batting, we had about 50 people in our living room watching the game. By the time it was India's time to bat, there were only 4. Australia got 360 and everybody lost hope, and most of the folks were gone from our house. Of course, India lost Sachin really early, and and then India started losing wickets regularly. Sehwag was the only one who got a attacking 50, but again India ended up way short. I think India was all out for 235, and which resulted in Australia winning the World Cup again. But my memories of that World Cup are very good, barring the finals, because India was not considered one of the strongest teams. India was playing in alien conditions in South Africa, but India managed to play really well and almost won us the World Cup. 2007. Now, 2003, if that was my best World Cup personally, 2007 was the worst. If you remember correctly, this was played in West Indies, and India and Pakistan were knocked out in the first round. The only game India won in that World Cup was against Bermuda. India lost against Sri Lanka and had bad defeat against Bangladesh, and they were eliminated in the first round. So that was extremely disappointing World Cup for most supporters. Although Australia continued to be the side to beat, they continued to beat almost every country in the league stages, including South Africa. One memorable game I remember was between Sri Lanka and South Africa, where South Africa was almost cruising, and then Lasith Malinga got 4 wickets in 4 balls in the end, and the match got really close. South Africa ended up winning it by 1 wicket, but again, that was a memorable game. The finals in that World Cup was between Australia and Sri Lanka. The one memorable incident from the World Cup final was Adam Gilchrist. He had stuffed a squash ball inside his glove, and he scored an amazing 100 in the finals. So that's the everlasting memory of that World Cup. Australia ended up winning their 3rd World Cup back-to-back, and they proved why they were a once-in-a-generation team by winning the World Cup for the 3rd time. Now, coming to 2011, World Cup was again coming back to India. India again were one of the favorites this time because they were playing at home, and India had a fairly strong team. Australia again were very competitive. There was Pakistan, there was Sri Lanka, so there were lots of teams which were pretty close in terms of their abilities in that World Cup. India started off a little slowly off the block. In fact, the only big team that India beat in the first league stage was West Indies. India tied the game against England, which India should have won, and India lost to South Africa in spite of Sachin scoring 2 glorious hundreds in those games. The other person who was consistently impressing with his performance was Zahir Khan. Zahir Khan was instrumental in India winning that World Cup with his bowling, up front, also his death over bowling, where he was reverse swinging the ball, and he was responsible for India managing to restrict the opposition considerably. Yuvraj also had a phenomenal World Cup with bat and bowl. He scored 100 against West Indies. He also had a 5-wicket haul in one of the games. So India in the league games were struggling a little bit, but by the time they came to the knockout stage, India was functioning like a well-oiled machine. And once India got to the quarterfinal, they beat Australia. Then they ended up beating Pakistan in the semi-finals, and India made its way to the finals. Sri Lanka also played well in that World Cup. They had a great team. They had solid batting in Dilshan, Sangakkara, Jayawardene, and they had bowlers like Muralidharan, Chamindavas, and the likes. So they were also chugging along fairly unnoticed during the World Cup. So come final, Sri Lanka batted first, and Zahir Khan bowled an amazing opening spell, but then Jayawardene, he got a number of partnerships going. He ended up scoring 100, and Sri Lanka got 270 plus in that World Cup final. Now 270 in a pressure cook situation in a final, can be a handful, and the way India started, things looked really shaky. 2 of India's premier batsmen, Virendra Sehwag and Sachin Tendulkar, were out in the first few overs. And now we had Gautam Gambhir and a relatively new Virat Kohli on the wicket, facing against bowlers who had their tails up since they had got Sachin and Sehwag out. They had a really good partnership, Kohli and Gambhir. Kohli was, of course, he was fairly new to the Indian team back then, but he provided good support to Gambhir, who was definitely in his elements, and India started making good progress. They had a partnership close to 100 runs when Kohli got out. Now, India so far had not used Mahendra Singh Dhoni in that World Cup effectively. In fact, Dhoni till that game had a terrible World Cup, but he very bravely decided to come in to bat at 3 down instead of sending Yuvraj, because they wanted to maintain a left-right batting combination, considering they had Muralidharan in the opposition, and Yuvraj in the past had struggled against spin. That turned out to be an inspired decision. Dhoni went in. Dhoni and Gambhir started getting a partnership going, and in fact Dhoni started off very briskly, and they took us pretty close to the winning score by themselves. Gambhir, unfortunately, when he was in 97, got out and walked in Yuvraj Singh, and the parting shot from that World Cup was when Dhoni hit that huge 6 to win the World Cup for India. Again, a tremendous reason for celebration for all of us. The 2011 World Cup, where India started really slowly, but then they peaked at the right moment to win it for us. 2015, back to Australia and New Zealand. This is a World Cup again. India just completed a tour of Australia, where Mahendra Singh Dhoni announced his retirement from Test cricket. Indian batting was really looking good in that World Cup. Again, Australia, they were playing at home, they were very strong. New Zealand had a very balanced team, good batters, good set of pace bowlers. So these were the 3 teams to look out for in that World Cup. India, as usual, customarily beat Pakistan in that World Cup again in the initial league games, where Virat Kohli got 100. And India overall looked very good in that World Cup. Australia also were playing really well. New Zealand, in fact, beat Australia in the league stages in that World Cup. The semi-final lineup was India against Australia and New Zealand against South Africa. India got demolished by Australia. Australia batted first, got 300 plus runs, and then India's batting capitulated under the Australian bowling. Then New Zealand and South Africa had a really close game where, if I remember correctly, Grant Elliott won the game for New Zealand, against all odds. So it was time for Australia to meet New Zealand in the World Cup finals. Brendan McCullum, he had been super innovative captain in that World Cup. He has been very aggressive, and he tried to do the same in the World Cup final, where he wanted to dominate Mitchell Starc early on. Unfortunately, lost his wicket in the first over, and then New Zealand ended up getting a very low score in the finals, which Australia were able to overcome easily. So Australia ended up winning their 4th World Cup, and their domination looked like it would continue for another World Cup. 2019, which was last year, India were hot favorites in that World Cup. The kind of performances India had put in throughout the year were staggering. Again, the batting was in supreme form. We had a pretty strong bowling lineup, a really strong pace attack with Mohammad Shami, Bhuvneshwar Kumar, Jasprit Bumrah. So very balanced side. Again, did really well in the initial stages of the World Cup. Rohit Sharma was on fire. He got 500s during the World Cup. Again, India looked very strong in the league games. We pretty much single-handedly destroyed all the other teams in the league games, other than the game against England, which India lost. England started a little slowly, but again, they started winning key games, and they were looking pretty strong. Uh, the semi-final lineup was India against England, and New Zealand were playing Australia. India unfortunately did not play well in the semi-finals. New Zealand batted first and they got a decent score on board. When India came to bat, India lost a heap of wickets early on. India lost Rohit Sharma, Virat Kohli, Shikhar Dhawan, KL Rahul, and the top 4 or 5 wickets were gone pretty quickly. Surprisingly, MS Dhoni did not come to bat when these wickets were falling early on. MS Dhoni batted at number 7. So by the time MS Dhoni came to the wicket, the game was virtually over. Ravindra Jadeja and Dhoni had a bit of a partnership where Jadeja started to attack the New Zealand bowling. In fact, he got an amazingly well-made 50 in that game. Unfortunately, Dhoni wasn't able to rotate the strike enough. Although they had a partnership, that resulted in pressure mounting on Jadeja, and he had to take a risk. Unfortunately, he got out. India still had a chance with Dhoni on the wicket. Dhoni was waiting to accelerate in the last couple of overs. Unfortunately, right before he could do that, he was run out by an amazing piece of fielding by Martin Guptill, and that ended India's chances. And what we thought was India's year turned out to be a disappointment, as India lost in the semi-finals. Now, coming to the final of the 2019 World Cup, that was possibly the best game of the World Cup. I mean, it was amazing how close that game was, and it went absolutely to the wire. And Ben Stokes was the person who was responsible for England pipping New Zealand at the post. Although New Zealand were sentimental favourites, the way New Zealanders played their cricket, I think most people other than the Englishmen were supporting New Zealand in the World Cup final, but it was not meant to be. And England finally managed to win the World Cup. Ian Morgan was the successful captain, and Ben Stokes was the reason why England won the World Cup. So these are my memories of the World Cup, right from 1975 to the latest 2019 World Cup. I thought I should share my memories and experiences about the World Cup with my subscribers. Please let me know if there are any other topics that you would want me to discuss in the future. With that, the only other request I have of you is to please subscribe to my channel. Make sure when new videos are out, you support them by viewing the videos, sharing it in your social media, and we will try to get you more interesting things in the future as part of this podcast. Thank you. Have a good one.